Okay, today we're going to talk about 5.15 Sustainable Agriculture. So our goal is by the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe sustainable agricultural and food production practices. To accomplish this goal, we're going to describe agricultural methods that promote soil conservation and describe agricultural methods that promote soil fertility. So let's start with soil conservation. Soil conservation is particularly important in the US right now because we're losing topsoil 10 times faster than we're forming it. Topsoil is that key to healthy plant growth, so without topsoil, we're not going to be able to continue to meet the demands of food production in the United States. So soil conservation is an agricultural technique that minimizes erosion. We can do this in a couple ways, but it's important mainly because the nutrients in the topsoil can be lost with erosion. So we want to minimize nutrient loss in topsoil. We want to minimize the loss of soil moisture. So we don't want that desertification. We want to minimize the loss of decomposers in topsoil and minimize the organic matter loss that traps soil moisture. So we don't want these things to go. We need them for healthy topsoil. And we can do this with a few different farming techniques. So if we look here, we've got 6 different farming techniques that are considered sustainable for soil conservation. And let's start by looking at contour plowing and terracing. They're pretty similar. Contour plowing is where you plow parallel to the natural slopes of the land instead of down the slope. And this is important because going across the land with the shape of nature prevents water runoff and soil erosion. Basically, you're forming these little mini terraces that are aimed at catching the water runoff and conserving all that soil in there. So we also have terracing, which is pretty similar, and this is cutting flat platforms of soil into a steep slope. The flat terraces catches water and prevents it from becoming runoff and eroding soil. So preventing runoff and conserving soil is our key here. We also have strip cropping. So strip cropping is also called intercropping, and this is where you're growing alternating rows of crops with a dense crop with a less dense crop. So for example, you may have hay and then corn and then wheat and then soy, and this prevents runoff from erosion from the less dense rows of crops. We also have windbreaks. This is sometimes also called agroforestry, where you're growing trees mixed in with your crops. Trees or other plants can block the force of the winds from eroding the topsoil, so you don't want them blowing away. It can also be used as a source of firewood or fruit, which can then lead to income, and it can provide habitat for pollinators and other species. So farmers in India have used agroforestry with their banana crops in order to reduce the effects of the monsoon on their topsoil and their plants. We also have no-till agriculture, which is where you leave a leftover crop instead of tilling it under. And this adds organic matter to the soil, which increases nutrients and soil cover and therefore increases the amount of moisture. And then it prevents erosion from the loosened topsoil. So as long as you keep that soil intact, it's not going to suffer as much erosion. And last but not least, we have perennial crops. So perennial crops are crops which are year-round instead of seasonal, and they're harvested numerous times. So as we'll see, the more you harvest a crop plant, particularly a perennial plant, the deeper it's going to send its roots. So these longer and more established roots hold that soil together and then prevent it from eroding and also prevent there being bare soil between harvests, which can become eroded or lose soil moisture. Additionally, we have soil fertility as a concern. And soil fertility sustainable methods are methods that restore nutrient levels in the soil, such as nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, or magnesium. So a monoculture, which is all one type of plant, if you continuously plant the same monoculture, it's going to deplete the soil of the same nutrients. So for example, a nitrogen demanding crop like corn that's continually planted year after year in the same field is going to start demanding more nitrogen from your soil. Over time, if you're not replenishing that nitrogen, you're going to have to continuously add more synthetic fertilizers to your crops. As we've learned in other videos, this becomes a serious issue. So you might consider rotating with something like a legume, such as peas or beans that have the nitrogen-fixing bacteria that will return that nitrogen to the soil instead of you needing to supplement with synthetic fertilizers. Additionally, you could use something called green manure, and this is leftover plant material that's left on top of the soil to break down. And some farmers between harvests may plant, particularly between seasons, may plant what's called a cover crop. And this is something that is just planted between seasons. Having a cover crop stabilizes your soil so you don't have a period where your soil is left bare. And again, it will release nutrients back into the soil. So last but not least, we have limestone, which is a sustainable way to decrease the acidity of your soil. So it's going to increase the pH, thereby decreasing the acidity. Our problem with acidic soils is that acidic soils have a high hydrogen ion concentration. The hydrogen ion concentration, when it's high, pushes out those charged nutrients from the soil. So we know that calcium usually is Ca+, Mg+. It pushes those out of the soil. It's called leaching, and those are no longer available to the plant. It also makes toxic metals more soluble in the soil, so plants may begin taking up toxic metals like aluminum. So if you see in this graph, we see that as soil pH increases for many of these important nutrients, we see that their availability also increases. The last thing I wanted to mention was called rotational grazing. So this is where you take your available grazing area and you break it up into sections and limit where your animals can graze so that you can move them frequently throughout these different pastures. This allows them to keep getting fresh grass so that they don't have to be fed grains as much, and reduces your feed costs, gives you healthier livestock, and it also gives you healthier grass. So animals are allowed to eat 50 to 70% of the cover, and then they're moved to another pasture, and they're not put back there again for another 25 to 30 days. So this little bit of grazing on the plants causes their roots to become deeper, so they push down further to get more nutrients. They also become stronger and they hold that soil in there better. And a unique thing about a lot of grasses is that when you trim them, they actually grow back better than they did before. So you're allowing your cows or sheep or goats or horses to eat some of the forage, so they're getting fed, and then you're moving them to another pasture and allowing the ones behind them to recuperate. So our goal today was to describe sustainable agricultural and food production practices. So we looked at practices that conserve soil. So it's kind of a limited resource for us because we're using it faster than it regenerates. And we also looked at methods to improve soil fertility and rotational grazing.